So you've had a very interesting and diverse career. Can you tell us a bit more about the thread that's run throughout all of the different opportunities?
Well, thank you, Jenna. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a great honor. I walked in earlier on, and there's this thing going with all the people that have been. I mean, I'm not Elon Musk, so I really appreciate you all coming today. Really. In fact, I came in and I saw Elon Musk, and I was like, awesome, and maybe I get to hear him, but sadly, I missed that. So I was sort of thinking about why, apart from the fact that we've known each other for many years, what I could sort of share that might be useful, might be interesting to you. And given you're here, you're here at an extraordinary time, not only an extraordinary time in the world, what feels like a real disjuncture and a real moment of sort of crisis and opportunity in the world, but also you're here at this sort of extraordinary point in your lives, which is this fantastic sort of moment of opportunity. And I was sort of reflecting on that privilege of the opportunity of having choices. And I was remembering when I joined McKinsey, there was this terrible talk that we were given when we joined McKinsey, and this senior partner sat us down, and I think with really good intentions, told us that we were made, that it was, not that it was downhill from here, but actually we could relax, because with our brand on your CV, you are unemployment proof. And it was just, there was this horrible silence in the room, and I think that most people in the room were like, yes. And I was like, oh, God, how terrible. What a... But I think that's part of the sort of extraordinary thing about being here is, in a way, that's true as well. I mean, it's not that it wasn't true what he said. At some level, it really was true. But I think that, obviously, the question was what the implication was of that, whether the implication is that one needs to be conscious of the extraordinary privilege that comes from being in that position, the weight of responsibility that one has in thinking thoughtfully and being thoughtful about the choices that you make, given that extraordinary set of opportunities that you have in front of you. And I think also, just to be clear that, I was very conscious of the fact that I was sitting there in that room, not through the virtue of anything that I had really done, not through the virtue of my hard work or my grit or my anything, and not because of something my grandmother told me when I was a little bitty boy, or, and none of those things, really. For reasons I really don't understand, as a result of forces completely beyond my control, I had found myself in that position. So again, I think that gave me pause to reflect on the choices. So what I thought I would sort of try and do is tell you a little bit, for what it's worth, about my story, about some of the things that I've done and some of the choices I've made, and then we can have a conversation about, whether... my guess is 87% of you will think I made lousy choices and that they don't really reflect the choices you would make, and maybe you'll never think about me or this ever again, which is fine. But I hope you'll think about the choices. I hope that we can, have a conversation about what some of those sort of tensions are. So Jenna asked what the thread was that joined my career, and I have trouble. That's a difficult question. Turns out that's a difficult question. The fact that they all begun with M is about the only thread that Jenna could help me with as we were preparing for this. So, yeah, I trained as a musician. I went to Mongolia. I joined McKinsey. I worked in the media. What did I do next? I worked in the media. I worked for many years in mining. And right now I work in mission investing, which I'm kind of fudging to make the M thing work. I agree. What I do now is I work at the Open Society Foundations. I work for George Soros, who is the philanthropist and the founder of what is, I think it's hard to tell, but we think maybe the second largest foundation, private foundation in the world. It's focused on human rights, focused on social justice, on democracy, on transparency. It's quite an extraordinary place to work in many ways. It's been focused on these things for 30 years, and it's truly a remarkable institution. It has 20 or so thematic programs that work on everything from independent journalism to human rights and criminal justice. It has global programs and foundations. In fact, it's a network of foundations in over 40 countries in the world, all of them with local boards, with local staff, deeply rooted in those local communities. Many foundations, I think, quite appropriately and quite bravely work on solving really difficult problems. We work on problems that are insoluble. And we do so in the knowledge that it's important that people work on those problems as well, problems that can't be solved, that can't be scaled. And so we work on injustice, and we work on things like that are not soluble. I work heading up an economic advancement program, which is part of that. We focus on, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and as part of what I do, I run the impact investment arm for the foundation globally. But let me sort of come back to that and tell you a little bit about sort of how I got there. I grew up in an artistic family. My father's an actor, my mother was a dancer, my brother's a theater producer, another brother is a poet. I'm really the black sheep of the family. Something, I think, over the years of an embarrassment to the family. And I trained as a classical musician in London, and I was all set for a career as a conductor. I had the hair, if not the talent, to be a great conductor at that age. And I didn't really know what I was going to do apart from that. I had done that from a very early age. And I was at a dinner party as a student, and I was talking very animatedly about about ideas that I held very passionately, that I believed in. Ideas like that the world is one country and mankind its citizens. Ideas that the men and women are like two wings of a bird, and we need equality to be able for civilization to thrive. Things like this that I believed in passionately, and things like this that seemed to be becoming current and seemed to be becoming global in their belief. And yet I was talking, what would it be like? Is there a country in the world where people don't, if you went to a country that was isolated, that was cut off from the rest of the world, would people believe these things anyway? Are they intrinsic? Are they transmitted by? I was pretty intense as a student, as you can understand. I'm really worried about these things. And I think to sort of shut me up, somebody said, listen, you should go to Outer Mongolia and study the music there. And everybody laughed, and I laughed, and I didn't know where Outer Mongolia was, and it just stuck in my brain. So everybody went off, and I was left with this, what would it be like if you went to Outer Mongolia and studied the music? And so I looked it up. There was no sort of internet, so I looked it up in a phone book. Doesn't translate, I understand, it's okay. Big book, it's many years ago. And it turns out that there was a Mongolian embassy in London. And so I called the Mongolian embassy, and nobody answered. And that was the end of the story, which would have been not nearly as good a talk if that really had been the end of the story. It would have been, but I forgot about it, honestly. I called and nobody answered, and I let it go. And life is busy and you move on, and I was in my final year as an undergraduate. And I remember one Friday afternoon, I saw this piece of paper on my desk with the telephone number of the Mongolian embassy, and kind of as a joke. I don't know what I was thinking. Really, I dialed it without preparation, without thought, without strategy. I just dialed this number. And of course, they answered Friday afternoon, and they said, I couldn't think of what to say. I wasn't prepared. The only thing I could think of was I couldn't afford to pay my rent as a student. I didn't have any money. And this guy had told me, go to Outer Mongolia to study the music. So I said, I'm going to Mongolia to study the music, and I need money. Do you have a scholarship? The poor guy, who regretted answering the phone at the Mongolian embassy, said, no, we don't have any money. Call the British Council, and hung up. Now, the British Council is like a sort of British government overseas development sort of agency that promotes education and research. So I called them. British government offices close around midday on a Friday, let me tell you. So I called at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. Almost no chance anyone's going to answer this phone. And of course, they answer, and they put me through to the Mongolian department. Phone never rings at the Mongolian department. So they answer, and the guy says, well, actually, it's amazing you should call, because we do have one scholarship, actually, and not many people apply. And actually, few people do apply, but they want to do politics, and music is kind of harmless, and so why not? You should. That sounds good. Why? The thing is, the application closes on Wednesday, so you need to put an application in. So I go to the. Again, you can't Google anything, right? There's no internet. So I go to the library and I look up where is Mongolia, and I find a thing, and I find a record of Mongolian music, a CD, not a CD, a record. We're on a whole nostalgia trip here. This is a very retro talk I'm giving. So I listen to this. It's incredible music, extraordinary, beautiful, sort of just extraordinary music, and a whole series of extraordinary things happen that week. I won't tell you the whole story. One of them is that the woman who made this record 20 years earlier, the name was familiar. I called my mother in Australia. I said, why do I know the name of the woman? She said, when you were 1, we used to live in the basement of her apartment, and she used to show you the Mongolian violins on the wall and the African drums and things. So I thought, okay, this is a little weird. I have this strange kind of spooky connection. 3 things happened that week. I made my application, and 3 weeks later, I get the scholarship. They ring me up and they say, congratulations, you're going for 9 months to Mongolia. That was the sort of thing that you used to have as a sentence in Russia. 9 months in Mongolia, bang. And I'm going to Mongolia for 9 months. So, that's an extraordinary thing. I get on this train in London in 1988, and I go for 2 weeks across Russia, across Siberia, and I arrive in Mongolia, and it's minus 40 degrees, and I don't speak a word of Mongolian. And my life has changed. And I spent 7 years in and out of Mongolia, and 2 of those years I spent living with a family of nomads in the Western Mountains. While I lived there, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, the world changed, the Berlin Wall fell, and the kids I've been students with in my first year surrounded the parliament and brought about a revolution, a political revolution in Mongolia, as in so many parts of the world. And suddenly what felt like a kind of random, nobody in my world understood what I was doing. I had just dropped off the edge of the earth. Suddenly I was in this extraordinary experience, and each year I stayed on for another year, and so it went on. So I spent 7 years in Mongolia, and I had run out of research money, and along the way I started a company, and just because I couldn't think of anything else to do. I wasn't a social entrepreneur. I wasn't an entrepreneur. I didn't know what that was. I just, I took the money that we got from our wedding presents, and we started a little travel company, and then, a year later we sold it. Not a sort of Facebook sort of selling it sort of thing. I just gave it to the guy I'd had running it, and he promised to give me some money at some point, many years later, which he did. So I had this extraordinary experience. I spent 7 years in Mongolia. I was married at that stage. We went to Australia, and I was about to turn 30. I was staying in a friend's apartment. I had 6 weeks before I was going to have to move in with my parents. This is not a great moment in my career. I don't know if you call it a career at this stage. And I interviewed with everyone. I interviewed for an advertising agency and a bank and a this and a that, and anybody who would sort of talk to me. And everybody wanted to buy me a drink, and what was it like living with the nomads and the yaks and fantastic. Of course, we can't give you a job. I mean, So I was sort of really interesting but unemployable, at that point in my career. And I sat down with a friend, and he said to me, what you should do is you should do an MBA. Because he said he was at McKinsey. And he said, they'll never hire you at McKinsey. But what you should do is you should do an MBA, and then they might hire you. If you get an MBA, you've got a kind of funny background. That's kind of amusing. And then you've got an MBA, you're a serious person, and then maybe you can get it at McKinsey. And I thought, the funny thing was, I thought, wow, imagine doing something in order to be able to do something else afterwards. This was like he said, it's called strategic thinking, Sean. That sounds smart. But for me, as someone who had always maximized the opportunity that I had in front of me, had lived completely sort of in the moment and had just seen what were the possibilities that I could do at any particular time, that idea of thinking 2 steps ahead, picking a point and sort of driving for it, and I tell it as a joke, but genuinely it was a sort of a light bulb moment for me. I knew that it wasn't for me, that way of thinking and doing an MBA, and so I kind of forgot about it. I met a guy at a dinner party. Someone said, wow, Mongolia, how interesting. You should come for an interview. And I in fact, ended up doing 11 rounds of interviews at McKinsey and somehow getting a job with 2 degrees in music and 7 years in Mongolia. And I was the sort of comic relief, the wild card sort of candidate for the year. But I had an extraordinary time. But I want to reflect just for a second on that experience of sort of being strategic versus being tactical, about thinking about straight lines in one's career versus non-linear sort of paths. Because I think that, and I reflect on this now in the work that I do. Of course, I make a joke about it, and I've spent a great deal of my life learning about and trying to think more strategically than then anyway. But even now, I find there is, you couldn't draw the straight line from music to McKinsey. The shortest distance between those 2 points, there was a set of things you'd have to do, and it wasn't go to Mongolia. There wasn't a strategic model or a career counselor that would have given that advice. And yet, it was the shortest distance. For me, that was the non-linear path between those two. And I think that, as I reflect in the work that I do now on the sort of flaws of design thinking and the flaws of the sort of hubris that comes with picking a point and driving towards it. The sort of preference for data and learned experience over lived experience. I find that my experience of my career and my experience in the work I do leans much more heavily on a deep understanding of the complexity and trying to maintain a sense of humility in the face of that complexity and that volatility, rather than presuming to be able to design one's way through it. Now, the place I work now, I think, has an interesting response to that, which is a deep belief in pluralism. There's a great story about George Soros, and someone was talking to him about a series of very random grants that he'd been making in an area of new economic thinking, just different things, and didn't seem to have any. It wasn't. And someone said to him, it's like you're funding the haystack in order to find the needle. And he got very agitated. And he said, you've completely missed the point. There is no needle. It's all about the haystack. I love that response. I love the idea that creating environments in which there's plurality of thinking, in which there are a range of options, rather than seeking to prosecute a particular designed solution and a particular point outcome. I think it's a rational response to the sort of complexity that we face in our careers and the sort of complexity we face, in the world in which we work. So I went in a few months from living in the mountains to being an associate at McKinsey. It was kind of a shock. I had 5 extraordinary years, wonderful years at McKinsey. I worked with people who trained and apprenticed me. It really was an apprenticeship. They coached me. They were very patient with me. I didn't know what NPV stood for. I didn't know how to switch to an Excel on, none of these things. So people were generous and really helped me, and I learned a huge amount from other people. I did a whole range of work. A great deal of the work I did was in media, and it was the sort of Web 1.0. And I was all on set now I had the hair to be a McKinsey partner. It's all about the hair. At that stage, I was all set. Maybe I had the hair and not the talent again to be a McKinsey partner, but I was absolutely on that track. And somebody offered me the opportunity to come and run a film studio. And I just always thought that was the coolest thing you could possibly do, would be to run a film studio. So I did, and I spent 5 years working in the film and television industry in the UK, making film and television with US studios. At the end of which, I didn't know what to do next again. And I set about trying to... The one thing that I felt at that point in my career that I was really focused on was mastery. I saw that all my career I'd been a sort of jack of all trades doing lots of different things, but that there were people who'd got those 10,000 hours, people who really had that deep mastery of a subject, and I really admired that. And so I said, I don't want to do consulting, I don't want to do advisory work, I'm going to really try and get a job. And I didn't. I almost got 3 incredible jobs. I almost got this job at Pixar, this incredible place. I had never been to anywhere so wonderful. And I worked in the film business. This was dying and going to heaven. And within a week, I'd interviewed, I'd met everybody. They offered me this extraordinary job. It was going to the board on Friday. And I was going to get the offer. I was looking at schools for my kids. And then I got a call on the Saturday, and something had happened at the board. There was a hiring freeze, and they couldn't talk to me anymore. I was devastated. 6 weeks later, Pixar sold to Disney. So that was the best job I didn't get. And there were 2 others like this, 2 other extraordinary jobs that I almost got and I didn't get. And so I found myself doing more consulting and doing more advisory. And I thought I'd share that just because otherwise it sounds like this kind of, just walking through this straight path of things. But there were all these things along the way that I really wanted that, I failed to achieve or didn't get, or for whatever reason. So I was visiting China doing due diligence on a deal, and I found myself at an extraordinary table at the launch of this huge new property venture, and this was the sort of the great and the good of China. I was doing due diligence on an acquisition, and it was this extraordinary conversation. It wasn't the conversation I thought I would hear when I went to China. These were the heads of the big corporations, these were internet entrepreneurs, these were government officials. And the conversation I thought I would hear in China was about money and economic development and opportunity and planes and private jets and things. And instead I heard this extraordinary conversation about the moral education of the next generation. I had never sat at a table of people who were thinking about their society in this extraordinary fundamental way. It was very exciting and very challenging. And I realized that anywhere in the world, that Beijing was probably the place where the future of the planet was sort of being thought about and was being shaped intentionally or unintentionally by an extraordinary group of people. So I went out on the balcony and I called my wife and I said, I've got it. The whole thing about getting a job and not mastery, why don't we move to China instead? And by the end of the phone call, my wife had agreed, and we put our kids on a plane about 6 months later, and we moved to China. And I didn't have a job or anything. And we figured that we would learn about China, that we would, something would work out. And we thought that it was an important time to expose our family and ourselves to what was going on in China. And as I arrived, some of those friends at that dinner asked me to come and help them with the IPO of their company. I didn't know anything about real estate. I didn't know anything about China. I didn't know anything about capital markets. But they said it was okay because they trusted me. And in that environment of complexity, an important thing to rely on is trust, human relationships. Again, not learned experience and a resume with the right skills, but very human, very direct qualities that could be relied on. And as of that, I had an extraordinary experience, worked with them on the IPO, was introduced to Goldman Sachs, who asked me to work with them, and I did for the next 7 years as an advisor, but funnily enough on Mongolia, where there was a big wave of interest in mining and natural resources. Through that, I got to meet the chief executive of one of the largest mining companies in the world, who was making a $6-7 billion investment in Mongolia. They were going to be 35% of the GDP of the country. How do they behave in that environment? What does it look like to be a corporate citizen with that degree of influence on a society? And so asked me to come and help them, and I spent 4 or 5 years working with them on that. And so at the end of my time in China, thinking about how to return to the West, I had a call from a headhunter about this job, and I've been very privileged to take this opportunity. So that's a long, windy journey, and M is about the only thread that I can draw through that. Except I think the other thing is responding to complexity and is being open to opportunities that don't look like the next linear move and that don't necessarily make strategic sense, but make deep tactical, deep immediate sense.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing such a beautiful and diverse story. Coming to the work you're doing now, can you talk a little bit more about what economic advancement means to you and to the Soros Economic Development Fund?
Yeah, so there are, I'll sort of tell you our strategy. How about that? And see if I can convince you, and you can call me on it if you don't buy it. So we started with the name. I was told that the name of the program was the Economic Advancement Program, not economic development. And we went away and we thought about what is economic development? What's the purpose of economic development? It's become an end in its own right. The purpose of economic development is economic development. The purpose of economic growth is economic growth. We felt that as a foundation focused on human rights and democracy, that we should question that we should ask why, not why is economic development valuable and important, but what our role in that might be. And so we have chosen to focus on that aspect of economic development that promotes open societies, that is instrumental to developing the open society. I think that, if you build a mine, you can be forgiven for thinking it generates money, it contributes to GDP, it's a good thing. That's economic development. China has had a huge amount of economic development. But economic advancement, the development of a society that goes along with that economic development, is different. And you could argue that actually social justice is a trade-off that people are being asked to make in many places against economic development. People are being offered those two things as a choice. I think we used to think that they go hand in hand. You do one, the other comes. You get more democracy, you get more economic growth. It hasn't worked out like that. And so as a program, we're being intentional about focusing on those forms of economic development that contribute to the open society. The second part of our strategy is that we place investment as part of the toolkit that we want to deploy to address these problems. there's a great sort of, I mean, there's no question that we'll talk maybe more about this. There's no question that impact investment is a valuable and powerful tool. Markets can be powerful forces. But at a very basic level, anybody who has invested in an emerging market impact business knows that very often the failure is not because of a lack of capital. Money is rarely the problem. The failure is almost always the policy environment in which that investment takes place, or the lack of capacity in that society to absorb and to work with those investments, or the lack of civil society that's able to hold governments accountable. And so we're trying to take a systemic view of these problems. I think the next wave of impact investment is going to be focused on solving problems. And maybe not solving problems, but engaging with local people in systems and trying to address multiple points in those. And so we felt as a program that we wanted to deploy grants to civil society, policy in order to work with governments, and we wanted to work with impact investment where there is a need for sort of private capital. The third thing is that we are focused on, we're conscious that in many of these systems there's an ecosystem of many players already existing, and that what is important is that we try to enable and very often don't play the primary role ourselves. So we have been intentional in building the capacity to build collective action. There are many problems for which, again, capital is not the problem. Lots of people engaging in this is not a problem. There are many players already. There's a sort of fetish for the new. There's a desire to found something and start something and do something new and make an intervention. And actually what we're trying to do in many of these is simply convene existing players and provide some middleware to sort of join them together. And finally, we've focused on participation. I think one of the real challenges with impact investment, with economic development, is not what's been done, but the way it's been done. Decisions are made in rooms in which the people who are the so-called beneficiaries of these investments and the so-called beneficiaries of these interventions are not present. They're not designing the outcomes. They're not even in the conversation. And so we've focused really on how we can build a more participatory approach to this. Let me give you an example. I was in Sri Lanka, in the north of Sri Lanka, and talking with a senior minister there about their experience of the last sort of 10 years post-conflict. And there are enough Brits in the room who will get the Monty Python reference here, but it was a kind of a funny moment because because he said, what did that regime ever do for us? What economic development did they ever bring to us? And one of the people in his team said, well, they built the roads. All right, they built the roads. But apart from the roads, what did they ever do for us? Someone said, well, the schools. And we have got 3G now. That's really nice, yeah. Oh, and the clinics, yeah, the clinics have been... Okay, apart from the roads and the schools and the clinics and the telecommunications, what did that regime ever do for us? And it went on. It was like, the Monty Python. What did the Romans ever do for us? The point of the story for me was that he said at the end, you know what, it doesn't matter what they did because we weren't involved. They never asked us what we wanted. So we don't have cars to drive on the roads. We don't have teachers to be in the schools. We have this economic development that you gave us, but we'll burn it all down because we're not involved. And I think that speaks to the importance of people being and having a sense of agency over the direction of and the crafting of the solutions and the crafting of the responses to the problems. And so without that participation, we think it's going to be very hard for any of these interventions, any of this money, any of this investment to work. And so those are sort of 4 aspects that we're trying to build into our approach to what is at heart still, impact investment and grant making. And there are others. I think, the Omidyar network are really fellow travelers in this regard, and I think there is a new generation of those who are looking more systemically at many of these problems in this way.
Great. And more broadly, as you think about your take on impact investing in the industry and your space within that, how do you think about that, and how do you think about shaping the industry?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm new to this space and I'm learning, and so I don't want to sound like I have the answer. And I think that there has been such extraordinary work that has been done by many people from here and around the world in this space, and in finding ways of applying the power of markets to solving problems. And I find it inspiring. And I find it to me, my career has sort of converged on exactly this, on how can one use the power of markets, how can one use the power of, and the scale and all of these things, that resources that the private sector has to do what is really most urgent and important. So I'm not in any way criticizing, critiquing, naysaying the extraordinary work that's been done. And I get why so many people sitting in your shoes at this moment of opportunity in your life see this as an opportunity. But there are aspects of it either that trouble me, or let me put it this way. If there's going to be a second wave of impact investment, if there's going to be a next generation that's going to come from impact investment, my question to you is, what is that going to look like? Because I think there's a bunch of people who are set up to make sure that that next wave of impact investment is bigger and more retail and more muscular and a whole lot like what a kind of other previous generation of non-impact investment looked like. And you've got to figure out whether that's a good thing. So it's exciting that TPG is, everybody's in impact investment, right? TPG is going to do impact investment. Goldman Sachs is doing impact investment. You've got to work out whether that's happening because we're lowering the bar on what impact is, or if it's because we're scaling up the response and this is everybody genuinely getting it and getting on board. I think we have to at least ask ourselves the question whether using the tools, we have to at least be conscious that we're using the tools to solve problems, and the tools we're using were the very things that contributed to the problems in the first place. That at least should trouble us. It at least should ask us to ask some questions about whether we are sort of complicit in perpetuating, and I mean, I ask myself the question whether we think we can sort of get away with this. Like, this system and these tools have done such an extraordinary job in the West. Fund managers and investment banks and, the sort of global financial systems just has done an extraordinary job of solving social problems in the developed world. Now, suddenly fund managers are going to solve deep, intractable problems in the emerging world. It sort of seems quite hopeful. We have two objectives in our program. One is to champion marginalized voices in economic systems. And the other is to address those systems themselves, to question the fundamental premises of those systems itself. And we try and do both. I wonder whether the next generation of impact investing, the next wave of impact investment, is going to do the latter or not, or whether it's really sort of complicit in sustaining a system that has caused such deep inequality. And given the scale of the problem that we face, the scale of the global inequality and the scale of the resentment that's felt, the idea that we can, sorry, it's all good. Now we're going to just do the same thing, but we're going to do it a little bit, and it's all going to work out, I think is quite, I think it's wishful thinking. or at least I think it should give us pause. So my hope is that the next generation, this next wave of impact investment, I guess that you will all be going into building, will take a different approach. You know, we can't grow ourselves out of inequality. It's a lovely idea. We can sort of inclusively grow ourselves out of it. None of us are going to have to give up anything that we have experienced or we have. But the maths doesn't work. Can never catch up like that. And so I think we're sort of avoiding the difficult questions. So I think the next generation, the next wave of impact investment is, I hope, will answer those hard questions. I think that, you know, a great friend of mine, Anand Giridharadas, gave a talk in Aspen a few years ago, and he faced an extraordinary room named after a great titan of capitalism. And we have to realize, all of us, and me included, that we're here as a result of the largesse of that system as well, you know, and I'm very conscious of that. We're very conscious of that in what we do. And he asked that audience about generosity and justice, and I encourage you to look it up. It's a fantastic speech. And he said, you know, are we simply going to get together and talk about doing more good, or are we going to actually have to ask whether we have to do less harm, whether there's a more fundamental reimagining of some of the basic systems and assumptions that is necessary? So my hope is that the second wave of impact investment is going to be prepared to take much more risk, is really going to be prepared to be much more fundamentally addressing the systemic issues that underpin these, and not simply the sort of application of the old tools in a slightly new way.
Thank you. And one last question before we open up to the audience. As you think about this balance between doing good and doing well and the potential tension between the two, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I'd love to hear your answers to that rather than just mine. I came on a great quote the other day. I'm going to read it. Because I don't have great I'm not as you know, I'm not an economist, I'm not a political scientist, so I take quite a sort of personal view of these things. This is a great quote. Every choice we make as an employee or an employer, producer or a consumer, a borrower or a lender, a benefactor or a beneficiary, leaves a trace. And we have a moral duty to lead a coherent life where our economic decisions are in accordance with our ideals and our aims are matched by our actions. I think that's that coherence that, you know, you're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to figure out. Our coherence in our personal life, you know, what does that match look like? And our coherence in our professional lives and our investing lives. Because you can dress it up in lots of ways, but at the end of the day it becomes, I think it's a very personal question. And I think at the end of the day, you know, it's a moral question. I really do. Bono has been talking about impact investment recently. And, you know, he talks about so many things, I think, very, very effectively. But in that, he says, look, investing is not immoral, it's amoral. It's amoral. It just depends on who's using it and how it gets used. And that's true, sort of. I mean, I kind of believe that as well. But the economic arc of the universe is short, and it tends towards self-interest, if we're honest. And I think that there is an undertow, that the incentives and the way the system is structured, there is an undertow that pulls us towards self-interest and towards the accumulation and the concentration of wealth. And I think just have to be honest about it. We have to acknowledge that. It's not amoral. It isn't a neutral system that can just be pointed in this way or pointed in that way and magic happens. It's not. It's structured in a way that pulls all of us in our personal lives and in our work in one way. And it takes effort to tilt the board the other way. That's all. It takes effort and it takes sacrifice. And I think trivializing that by saying, You can absolutely have your cake and eat it. It's not a problem. You know what you can do? We can have our cake and let them eat it. We know how the last time that worked out. It didn't work out so well. So the idea of sort of inclusive growth and shared value and these things, I don't think that they're wrong. I just think they're insufficient to the scale of the problem. And so I think this next generation this next wave is going to have to really address these very, very, very fundamental issues. And we're going to have to think more fundamentally about the problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. I'd now love to open up to questions from the audience. We have 2 roaming mics, and it'd be great if you could introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background as you answer the question.
And actually, specifically, if you're going to ask me a question, I want to know what your answer is. Because, coming up with a smart question, all the hands went down immediately. It was fantastic. No questions at all. No, I'd love to hear what your view is on it. Please.
Hey, my name is Patrick Daniel. I really enjoyed your personal story and journey that you shared. I initially wanted to ask you about the different turning points and how you balance focus and the serendipity that you sort of talked about. But I think as we then talked about basically all these big issues around the world, I wanted to talk to you about what are your thoughts on decentralization as a major theme of the 21st century and as a possible solution of solving all of these problems. And since you asked that I should also answer my own question.
What do you think about decentralization?
I do think blockchain technology and the social implications of blockchain technology and all these different decentralized trends I was seeing can really undermine the global power infrastructure that we have. And so I think this is a huge paradigm shift which will be very difficult to go through because the existing global elite will not, just give it away without a fight. So from your perspective, with all the experiences you had, I'm just curious to understand, how you understand all these, these big trends.
That's a great question. Do you want to ask a few and see if we can get them together, or do you want to just
maybe let's do one at a time.
Okay. Well, so I think the question you have boils down to power. And where does power sit? And how does power get moved around? And clearly, the emergence of new technologies can cause significant shifts and can cause significant ruptures in established balance of power, which is what makes them so troubling and so exciting at the same time. What is clear, though, is that the system is highly adaptable and highly resistant to that change, and it absorbs disruptive elements, and it brings them back in. That's my point about impact investment. Potentially highly disruptive, potentially risk that it gets reabsorbed and brought back in, as those technologies can as well. I think the question, one of the questions that we're looking at the moment is the question of digital identity, is the question of identity. And we're looking at it in the context of the refugee situation. And it's one of the most sort of popular themes for impact investment at the moment is new technologies that can be disruptive. But we have to ask ourselves, who do we want to be controlling the means of identity by which we have a presence in the world? There is a very real possibility that within 2 or 3 years, that will sit in the hands of, major global corporations, many of whom are birthed and live, not within many miles of this hall. That's a real possibility. There is a real possibility, though, that governments will establish, and India has done an extraordinary job of it, something that is both in equal measure, those of you aware about the digital stack, the India stack, is an extraordinary development that holds possibly equally exciting and terrifying consequences. And so I think, as the Open Society Foundations, I make 2 observations. One is, the problem in this area is not a lack of technology and not a lack of investment. The problem is collective action. The problem is that it requires governments and civil society and the private sector to really come together in order to be able to find a solution that will respect rights and will shift power and will do so at scale and be effective for marginalized voices. That's a very complicated problem. And what tends to happen is that the private sector, with capital, with free of regulation, increasingly free of regulation, moves quickly to fill that gap. And I think that's we should be concerned about how that happens. We should watch that very carefully. But I think it's very exciting at the same time.
Thank you. Please.
I'm Radhika Shah. I'm a co-president here at the Stanford Tech Innovation Club of 900 faculty, students, and alumni, and an advisor to the Sustainable Development Goals Philanthropy Platform, which is a catalytic platform for collaboration within countries, contextual, but also global, for informing policy and funding scalable innovation. Very, very inspiring to hear your life journey. Thank you for sharing that, and especially the non-linear part. My question is around impact investment, the point that Jenna touched on, profit versus mission. Looking from an impact entrepreneur's perspective, how does a mission-driven entrepreneur who wants to really be very mission-driven achieve this fight self-interest? And really, earlier you mentioned that economic development and social justice may really be a trade-off. And my own, since you wanted us to share our views, as I've been observing and thinking, my own sense is that in impact investment too, it's not always a win-win. It's often a trade-off for that entrepreneur, having mentored many, profit versus mission. What is some advice for that entrepreneur? And second question is, what is the role of international or universal policy for impact investing? Because there are entrepreneurs being funded by organizations from different countries. It seems to be becoming a very global ecosystem. The rules are different in each country. Is there a role here for the UN or other forms of international policy for impact investing that can help, especially to fight the self-interest, so it is truly focused on inequality and the problems addressed by the SDGs?
Come up here and sit.
Yeah.
You know more about this than I do. This is brilliant. I would love to hear your thought on the first one, though. Just 2 minutes. Just give us your view on that first question. We won't be able to do all of it.
This is something I think a lot about. I don't have a strong opinion because I don't know that. I have seen many entrepreneurs. I founded the local chapter for Ashoka, so the Ashoka Fellows, so many of them who are mission-driven entrepreneurs. Most of them, traditional ones, are not for-profits and non-profits. In the limited data, and then there are several impact entrepreneurs who are for-profits here. In the data set, I've seen one thing I've observed is that the ones who are not focusing on profit seem to be even more mission-driven. That's my subjective opinion and observation. And I've seen that across most that I've seen, and I don't know if that's because they can optimize just for one goal, or if they're really more mission-driven people being drawn towards purely mission. And I'm also from the for-profit side. I see the value of sustainability, and yet I think about this quite a bit. So I don't have an answer, but I have a hypothesis that perhaps the caliber of entrepreneur that's going towards mission alone is more mission-driven. And that's my current hypothesis, but I would love to change that because these entrepreneurs are always looking for funds. So
sure.
I don't know what the answer is to how to change that.
Sure. It's a great, huge question, and it's a great question. I would love to. So I think at some level the question is, do we have to make a trade-off? I want to just be clear what I was saying before about economic development and social justice. I think that increasingly many places in the world people are being offered those as mutually exclusive alternatives, that they have to choose one versus the other. And I think we believe very much that there is common ground, that in fact the space in which economic development can enable social justice is a vibrant and contested space, but nonetheless filled with opportunity. There's another level of the question, though, which is there any trade-off that you have to make between the profit motive and the impact motive. Can you have your cake and eat it? And I think you can tell from what I've said before that I think that there are trade-offs that we have to make. I think simply, in all cases, imagining that one can do both without compromise is unrealistic. I think it's unrealistic to the generations of people that have worked with good intent and with deeply thoughtful, in deeply thoughtful ways on very intractable, deep problems of poverty. I think it's just magical thinking to imagine that there are scalable, simple solutions that can address those. At the very simple level, patience in capital, the requirement for much longer time frames itself is a compromise with the short-term, profit maximizing position. And I think that's true of entrepreneurs. But I think we have to ask the question about, what is enough and whether we are prepared to make that effort and make those sacrifices and make those trade-offs. Because at an individual level and at the level of a single investment, I believe in many cases, if not all cases, a real trade-off has to be made. But we have to be comfortable doing that. There is a name for transactions where one person does well at the expense of others. It's not investment, it's thieving. We don't need, there's a name for those transactions. They're just wrong. And the idea that we need to have a name called that of impact investment for a transaction in which externalities are considered and various stakeholders are respected and both parties come out in a reasonable way, that should be called impact investment, that seems odd to me because we have another name already for the other and it's actually, thieving. So why don't we just, maybe this next generation of impact investment ultimately will reclaim the notion of investment as a reasonable and fair and balanced transaction. Anything else seems terrifying to me.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm so sorry we're out of time, but so appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and thank you for all of you for being here.
Thank you.